Videos are ideal for learning Chinese because the visual element enhances comprehension and engagement. But what videos should you watch? What are the best YouTube channels? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about using videos for learning Chinese, and more specifically, we're going to talk about the best YouTube channels for learning Mandarin. As usual, there is a written article on Hacking Chinese corresponding to this podcast episode, which I have linked to in the show notes, and in that one I have presented all my recommendations for the best YouTube channels for learning Chinese. I'm not going to go through all the recommendations in this podcast episode, however, and for a number of reasons. First, it's hard to navigate. You are probably not interested in all the types of YouTube channels that I'm going to recommend, so listening to me droning on about beginner videos when you're an intermediate learner might not be your idea of fun, and therefore you can just head over to the written article, which has a nice table of contents that you can navigate and find the YouTube channels that you are interested in. Another reason I don't want to spend this episode talking about the recommendations is that I will update the article when I find better YouTube channels. And updating the article is easy, but updating a podcast episode is not. So since I want this episode to be relevant even if I update the recommendations themselves, I'm going to talk about the different kinds of channels that I recommend and also how to use them to best improve your Mandarin. Before discussing the different categories and how to use them though, I'd like to thank everybody who has recommended YouTube channels. There are hundreds of channels for learning Chinese and each channel might have hundreds of videos, and I cannot watch all of them on my own, so I rely on recommendations from people like you. So if you have sent something in, thank you, and if you find something that you like a lot and that I haven't mentioned in my article, please send it to me and I will have a look. Like I said, I will update the article to make sure that it does contain the best YouTube channels for learning Chinese. So before we go through the different categories of recommendations and some things that are worth knowing about them, I want to say a few general things about using YouTube to learn Chinese. This is something we have discussed before on the podcast, namely in episode 216, which is a kind of companion episode to this one. In that article, I talk more about how to use videos to learn successfully, and I also discuss in more detail why you should spend all your time focusing on content in Chinese rather than content in English about the Chinese language. I also go through 6 steps for using YouTube to learn Chinese successfully, and the first step is to explore new resources, and that is what this episode and the accompanying article is all about. Then we have watch and listen. Obviously, you need to watch the videos and listen to the Chinese in them to learn something. But there's also more to this than you might think at first. For example, should you use transcripts? Should you use them before you listen or after? And so on. The next step is to watch and listen again, or read them if you're focusing on the written language. And this is often neglected, especially for listening comprehension. Re-watching episodes you find difficult can be very helpful. And sometimes content that feels very difficult can become manageable simply by watching it one more time. The next thing you should do is to use scaffolding of various kinds. There are various ways of helping your comprehension. For example, you could use transcripts, like I said. You can use YouTube's built-in function to lower the rate of speech, and there are also third-party apps that help you learn languages through these videos. Number 5 is about downloading content so that you can listen to it without having to watch the video and do so on the go. And that is indeed the final step, to review, usually on the go, and when you have the audio available, you can listen to videos that you've previously watched to review the vocabulary and grammar and to enjoy the content one more time. Another thing I want to touch on before we move on is the question of difficulty. So how hard should the Chinese that you listen to and read actually be? This is a rather complex topic, which I have a lot of things to say about, but fortunately I've already done so in a recent episode, which was episode 236, which also happens to be a video episode, so you can check it out on my YouTube channel. The reason it's a video episode is because it's a lesson from my course, The Fluent Listener, and even if you can use YouTube to enhance other skills, I think listening is still the most important one. So if you're interested in more structured advice on listening comprehension and how to become a fluent listener, you can check out the link in the show notes and of course that example lesson on my YouTube channel. I think that's enough about learning Chinese through YouTube in general, so let's have a look at the different kinds of recommendations, the different categories that I present in my article. So in the article, I have recommended 3 types of videos. First, we have YouTube channels in Chinese. Second, we have YouTube channels about Chinese language and culture. And third, we have channels focusing on how to learn Mandarin. Out of these 3 categories, you should spend almost all your time in the first, i.e. videos in Chinese, because that's how you learn the language. You can occasionally sprinkle in some videos about Chinese language and culture, which are largely in English, or you can watch something about how to learn Mandarin, such as my podcast, which is also available on YouTube. But the point here is that you should spend a small minority of your time with these types of videos, and most of your time should be spent engaging with the Chinese language directly through videos that are almost entirely or entirely in Chinese. That is indeed the first category, and since recommendations here depend a lot on your level, I have split this category into 4 subcategories. The first one is videos for zero beginners, that's A0 in the European Framework of Reference for Languages that I will use to denote difficulty here, but this category is then for people who know no Chinese at all or very little Chinese. You don't need any prior knowledge and you can just dive straight in. This is a good opportunity to point out that many YouTube videos have content on different levels, so just because I recommend a channel on the A0 or zero beginner level here, it doesn't mean that all their content is suitable for beginners. But in the article I point to specific playlists that you should use at this level, so I'm not just recommending the channel, I'm recommending specific content on the channel. This subcategory was by far the hardest to find good recommendations for. It's not that tricky to create content on YouTube for intermediate learners that is largely in Chinese, but doing so for zero beginners is very hard. It used to be that there was almost no such content on YouTube at all, but fortunately there are many comprehensible input teachers who have tried to put their content on YouTube, and some of it is very good, and I recommend the best that I've been able to find so far in this category. Before we move on to the next subcategory, which is beginner, I'd like to mention that just because you're no longer a zero beginner, it doesn't mean that the YouTube channels I recommended there are no longer useful for you. Indeed, you should check YouTube channels below your level, because that's excellent for extensive listening if you want to build volume and hear the words and grammar that you've learned over and over in different contexts and being able to make sense of that. And that is how you learn and build a solid foundation in Mandarin. This is true for all levels, so even if you're an intermediate learner, you should probably still check out the beginner category as well, in which I've put content on the levels A1 and A2. One of the major challenges when trying to sort content by difficulty, as I've done here, is that many of these channels use their own labeling system and they are not consistent and sometimes just not very accurate. So somebody might say that this is HSK4, and maybe it is, and maybe it's not. You don't really know until you watch the video, and analyzing thousands of YouTube videos is very time-consuming. Sometimes people use vaguer terms like beginner, intermediate, and so on, but in my recommendations I discuss this, so there are YouTube channels that have videos that are labeled intermediate, but I think they are for beginners, and therefore I've put them in the beginner category. We also have the opposite case where somebody says that something is for beginners, but I don't agree and I've put it in the intermediate category. So do be mindful of this. Labeling is not consistent across different YouTube channels and often not even within the same channel. Naturally, I'm just one person, so I have tried to arrange these in order of difficulty and put them in the right categories, but if you think I've made a mistake somewhere, for example, you think something is much harder than I seem to think it is, please let me know so I can have a closer look. At the intermediate level, which is levels B1 and B2, it becomes much easier to find content in Chinese aimed at learners. And this is because it's much easier to produce, because you can count on the student knowing basic vocabulary, grammar, and so on. So you can focus on telling stories and whatever you want. Another difference at the intermediate level is that the video format itself becomes less useful. If you're a zero beginner, you really need the video because that's the only way you're going to understand something which is in Chinese. They use pictures, body language, and so on. When you are at the beginner level, so A1, A2, that's still the case. You benefit hugely from seeing what's going on as you listen, and it's not just a disembodied voice talking about something you don't know what it is. When you reach the intermediate level, however, you might no longer need this type of video support. And so there are many podcasts which put their episodes on YouTube, but I have chosen to exclude these because I want to focus on video content. If you're interested in podcasts, I have you covered there as well, and I've already published a giant recommendation article with the best podcasts. And if you want to listen to that episode on this podcast, that's episode 190, or you can check the link in the show notes. The next category contains videos for advanced students, so that's levels C1 and C2. At this level, you're already comfortable consuming media aimed at native speakers, and so here I've merely suggested some YouTube channels that I like, and I have not spent that much time trying to find the best ones, because it simply depends on what interests you have and what you want to watch. That means we're done with the category containing videos in Chinese, and we can move on to the next category, which is YouTube channels about Chinese language and culture. These YouTube channels are very popular, usually much more popular than all the channels I recommended in the In Chinese category. And that is because I think it's a kind of infotainment if you want. You like the host, you listen to them explain something in English, and maybe you learned a little bit of Chinese by doing that, but that is nothing compared to what you would have learned if you spent that time listening to something in Chinese instead. So remember what I said earlier, you can sprinkle these videos in to relax or to learn something interesting now and then, but this should not make up a large chunk of your study time. It's easy to believe that we learn new words in Mandarin by someone teaching them to us, largely in English, or that somebody explaining a grammar pattern to us will enable us to use it. We learn these things by listening and reading and then trying them out and when interacting with other people, not by somebody explaining something to us in English. Now, I should mention that many of the channels here also have content which is more in Chinese. Maybe they have vlogs or they have other content that is largely in Chinese. But if most videos are largely in English, they belong in this category. The final category is the smallest, and that's YouTube channels talking about learning Chinese. So my YouTube channel, for example. Just like with channels focusing on content in English about Chinese language and culture, you shouldn't spend too much time in this category either. Well, I do hope that the content I produce can help you learn Mandarin, but it does so indirectly by accelerating your learning and making sure that the time you invest actually brings you closer to your goals. But you don't learn Chinese by watching my videos or listening to this podcast. This means it's time to wrap up this episode, so do head over to the written article on Hacking Chinese for all the juicy recommendations. And if I've missed your favorite YouTube channels, be sure to let me know. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.